Good evening, everyone. Welcome to University of Westminster. I'm Professor Dibyesh Anand from University of Westminster. My preferred pronouns he and him. I'll be in a conversation today with Lord John Mann. And I don't want to hold you back with my conversation here, but I was wondering where should I be sitting. So I realized I'm on the left of John here. By the way, I did ask him if he's okay with me calling him John rather than Lord, because I don't really believe in Lord and Sir. And he was more than happy about it and more than generous. So thank you so much for that. Otherwise, I would have felt a bit uncomfortable and be very bit standoffish, which I won't be. Now, that should set the tone for the conversation we have. And again, I'll not say much about our university values. That will come up later. But the only thing I would say is, when we gave this idea to Lord John's team, and some of the team members here, I have to thank them also, by the way. I know he's very important. He's at the heart of it. But his team members are equally at the heart of it. Because when I spoke to them, I got so many ideas. I thought, wow, this is a team one should work with. Like, when we put this idea, the initial idea was there would be a launch of a report which has been delayed. So there's no conspiracy behind that, by the way. But there will be a report that would come up. But report, more than report, it is the process that matters. And the reason I am personally invested, you may ask, why am I here? I'm here, of course, as a professor. I'm the co-chair of university's EDI committee. But I'm someone who has had a journey in recent times. I've focused a lot on racism for many years, challenging racism. But for me also, a shift, or rather, including anti-Semitism as a form of racism, has been a relatively new journey. So I start with that. I start with acknowledgement that I'm not an expert on it. But I'm someone who's very curious. I'm someone who wants things to change. I'm someone who wants to work with other people for it to change. So in that spirit, we approached him, and he kindly agreed to come here to talk about himself, which he doesn't know. He'll talk about himself also, but he doesn't know the questions, by the way, most of them, which is in my head. Even I don't know the questions because I wrote somewhere and I can't find it. But about himself, his interests, but more crucially, this report, as you can imagine, any report comes out of research and exercise. So what does that exercise show? What are the good examples we can learn from? And hopefully by the end of it, and it is being recorded, because of course there's some of you here, many of you will be watching us later. It's very important that rather than pretending that higher education doesn't have an anti-Semitism problem, we acknowledge their problems, we identify ways in which we do it, we learn from each other, and we challenge it. So that's the wider ethos behind why I wanted to be in conversation. But thank you so much, Lord John Mann, for joining us here. And my first question to you is, why was this exercise necessary?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and so nice to see that the front row has been left totally empty. So a classic meeting, even though it's a conversation. So I shall look at the back row as I address things so that you hear everything. There is a perception in the British Jewish community, a strong perception, that there's a major problem with anti-Semitism in universities. And when I do public meetings of the Jewish, I presume it's certainly majority Jewish community, organised by the Jewish community, so majority Jewish community, it's always an issue that comes up. When I speak to serious players, by which I mean, senior people abroad, and I get good access abroad, it's the first question that's asked, without exception. Why is there such a problem? Some call it British, some call it English, depends which country you're in our universities with anti-Semitism. So that is the reputation. My instinct was that there has been a serious problem of systems and knowledge across our university sector. There's a failure to deal with basic problems, and therefore the perceptions are part of some people's narrative and reality. And what we should do is therefore look and see exactly what's happening, but also look at the good things that are happening and what is needed to ensure that there is a parity and equality of the problems that Jewish students have alongside any other students. And so that's what we were attempting to do. Done it by going out to the universities. I think 50, last count it was 56 universities specifically engaged on this, including the, under some league table or other, the top 25 universities, all of them, and leading universities across every part of the United Kingdom, finding out the experience of Jewish students, listening to Jewish staff members, talking directly under every definition to university leaders, from vice-chancellors to others at different levels within universities. And we also had the advantage that I had spoken, before we began this particular project, to 3/4 of the vice-chancellors in the country in person on anti-Semitism over the previous 18 months, 2 years. So a dialogue had begun. And I was only interested in seeing what the reality is, the actuality, not what I might like to hear. But I'm very pleased to say that, without giving too much away, that what I thought was the reality is absolutely backed up by the research to such an extraordinary extent that I think it's conclusive in what works, what doesn't work, why things work, and what the fundamentals are. And I do think that we will have a situation, it's a long answer, sorry, the first one, but it's probably useful not to be too bitty at the beginning. I think we will be in a situation where UK universities will have a detailed narrative to be able to challenge anybody across the world who says that our universities have a big problem, and bigger than elsewhere in the world, with anti-Semitism. Because that is factually incorrect. It's also factually incorrect that we have a bigger problem than we had when I was a student. That's factually incorrect. We had a bigger problem in the 1980s than we have now, but there has been a transformation. Attitude is, I think, too big a word. It includes attitude of comprehension about how to deal with anti-Semitism, a real transformation in the last 18 months. And that is quite deep-rooted now in universities. And universities, of course, talk to one another, vice-chancellors talk to one another. And I think the simplicity of some of the basics has been very appealing to people, that it's not a complex web that is insolvable, that actually some basic principles, if applied, transform the situation. So that kind of is what the report has in it. Finally, it says, took a decision at the beginning not to put bad practice in. There is bad practice. There are 3 universities, which I won't be naming, who I will be going back to, 3 in particular. There's a couple more with little issues to sort out, but 3 in particular where they've got significant problems to sort out. And of those 3, 1 didn't know they had, and it's huge, but I've already told them, and they think it's huge now. 1 will argue about it and will lose the argument, and that might be a little bit bloody. And the 3rd one, well, all I can say is if they don't accept they have a problem, you will hear about that, because what's not acceptable is a university that doesn't address the problem. That's not acceptable. Same with anywhere else in society, or any other hatred, discrimination, racism. It's not acceptable when it's pointed out to people in detail if they're not prepared to accept there's a problem and at least listen to what the community impacted is saying some of the solutions are.
On that, again, thanks for that very detailed answer, because that sets the context, right? Now, before I ask you more about your research and finding, could you say a bit more about, in terms of through your research, why is there a problem? So, for instance, most universities will be aghast if they find out that they have racist practices, right? Of course, the racialization remains, we know it. There's a difference between policy and practice, lived experience, and what the approach of universities are. But most universities are quite serious and upfront and even vocal in saying that they are opposed to racism, sexism, etc., etc. But why, in its last 18 months things are changing, but why did it take so long for universities or higher education, forget university, higher education to recognize and acknowledge there's a problem? And what's at the root of the anti-Semitism within higher education?
Well, I'm not trying to be cryptic here, but again, without embarrassing a national organisation, I've had discussions today that have been very fruitful. The national organisation who are trying to change positively their definition of what racism is, an organisation that counters racism. And the definition that they've come up with is that racism is directly connected to power. If you're looking at anti-Jewish racism, that's a problem. It's an insurmountable problem. And so the fundamental problem for me is that universities have liked to see all racisms have to go together. Rightly, people saying there's no hierarchy, that this one is more important than others. Same with all other hatreds and discriminations. Universities very keen that there's no hierarchy, that's appropriate. But not then looking at the fact that not all hatred and discrimination manifests in the same way. And anti-Jewish discrimination and anti-Jewish hatred sometimes manifests in a very, very different way. And to give the easiest example, there's no other group that gets pilloried and abused for having money or for running the world's media, which are constructs of power. And therefore, how anti-Semitism manifests is sometimes different, not always. Sometimes entirely comparable, but sometimes different. And that hasn't been, I think, understood in how universities, and a lot of the initial reactions were, no, we're grouping everything together. We've got the equality laws, everything goes together. Well, in terms of identifying the problem and thinking it through, there needs to be more sophistication than that and more listening than that. So that is a key difference and key factor.
No, and that's a very important point, because as I said, a lot of instinctive reaction to racism is about relation of power. So those who are marginalized are the victims, and those who have power are the victimizers. So what you're pointing out is that specific manifestations of anti-Jewish animus or hatred defies that kind of understanding of racism and power.
But there is a second one that's more complex, and that is in relation to Israel. And plenty of people would like to duck away from that issue for all sorts of reasons, because it's political, because it's contentious, or the politics of Israeli politics. I think it's a reasonable observation to say they're very contentious at the moment, amongst everybody, including Israelis. So you have that as well. And I think where we've opened eyes in university leaderships and administrations is clearly, and we have a definition of anti-Semitism, which I think is now well understood at the top level of universities. the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which, I mean, I could always improve things and wording, but it has a key premise within it that's fundamental and really relevant in the universities. And that is, that definition of anti-Semitism doesn't say anything about Israel and the Israeli government. Nothing. That is not what it's about. Because attacking a government, any government, is fair game. And that includes the Israeli government. And it seems to be under a pretty ferocious attack at the moment. And we've a word for that, it's called democracy, or democratic debate, or civics, and civic power. So, anyone who says, well, if you attack Israel and the Israeli government, that's anti-Semitic, is wrong. But it doesn't mean that how people do it might not be anti-Semitic. And the IRA definition is very helpful there. Because the most common way that negatively impacts on Jewish people is when anything to do with Israel or Israeli politicians is labelled in some way as Nazi or as Holocaust this or Holocaust comparison that. And it's interesting. The last MP to be suspended from a whip in Parliament is an MP called Andrew Bridgen, who has been suspended, I am pleased to say, and he's been suspended for one reason only, breach of the IRA definition in the misuse of the Holocaust. That is all he has been suspended for. It's what he's been suspended for. And I predict he will not stand as a candidate. Well, he may, but not as a Conservative Party candidate at the next election because of that. Now, I could cite other examples of other politicians, but that's the most recent. And it's a simple example. It's the simplest, because there was nothing else. It was a simple breach of the IRA definition by the use of Holocaust. He was trying to prove his case, I think probably call it the anti-vaxxer case, with the Holocaust comparison. And that's not appropriate for Jewish people, for fairly obvious reasons. And I've argued, and I think my argument is coherent, that actually you weaken your argument by doing that, you don't strengthen it. So you want to attack the Benjamin Netanyahu's government and the settlement policy and so on. Here's a good idea. Don't be anti-Semitic when you do it, and your attack might be more effective. In fact, I would suggest will be more effective. But at the same time, not but, and at the same time, a Jewish person is entitled to identify themselves as a Zionist without any negatives. Indeed, the IRA definition is quite explicit about a state of Israel, the concept of having a Jewish state. And a Jewish person is entitled to believe in that and to cherish that and to articulate that without any negatives. Full stop. There's no add-on. And by the way, is allowed to say whatever they want. No, it doesn't say that. Doesn't mean that. Simply no negatives. And I, as someone who is not Jewish, and my wife's DNA checking on ancestry, etc., I could categorically say, I am not Jewish, I have no Jewish heritage of any kind. So as someone who is not Jewish, I am not entitled, if you are Jewish, to tell you or give you negatives if you're a Zionist, if you're an anti-Zionist, if you're somewhere in the middle, I don't have that right to define anybody. People have the right to define themselves. And that's pretty fundamental, I think pretty straightforward. But I think explaining that is the key learning that was needed in the universities. Let Jewish people be themselves. And that includes, it happens from my personal experience overwhelmingly, also from all the scientific assessment, to be the case that the majority of Jewish people in Europe and in this country, the overwhelming majority, are somewhere on that scale of being pro-Zionist. Somewhere. So we're talking the majority as well. But even if it was the minority, that right doesn't exist. In the same way, I don't have the right to be attacking someone because they proudly define themselves as anti-Zionist. And that's what they define their Jewishness as. For whatever reason. Sometimes it's for a religious reason, sometimes it's for a political reason, sometimes there may be other reasons as well, but certainly there are people who would define that as a political reason, and there are people who define that as a religious reason. Well, that's their right. And I have no right to be negative about them in their identity. That simple principle is, I think, the biggest transformation of learning. And then universities, final bit that universities then have to do, like other parts of society, is think common sense of how that you apply that. So, that it doesn't mean there's perfect scenarios all the time. If however it's described, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel combination sometimes, speaker speaks in a university, that might be discomforting for some people. I'll give you an actual example. Palestinian with a conviction in court for terrorist murder. So I'm talking legal definitions here of what the conviction was for, serves a prison sentence. I can think of someone who matches that, who is not a threat to this country. How do I know that? Because they've been to this country and the Home Secretary has not debarred them as being a terrorist threat. Therefore, they're not a threat. Therefore, they can speak here in this hall. Where's the problem? Well, the case I'm thinking of, the cousin of one of the people murdered by the terror group, this was an event in the early 70s, was studying at a university in London where this Palestinian speaker spoke and was very unhappy about it. I don't want this person to speak in my university because their group murdered my cousin. The Irish definition is really simple on this. Yes, you can speak, because it doesn't restrict freedom of speech. And a university thinking about the impact on that Jewish student and perhaps a wider Jewish community of students will see that there are some issues to address there. You can have a very distraught, very angry student. You may have others who are, let's call it in solidarity, whatever term you want to use, with said student. They have an equal right to speak. They may wish to demonstrate. Perfectly valid. They may wish to have a counter meeting. Perfectly valid. They may wish to break up the meeting. I would say not valid if I was running that university. Protest is valid. Challenge is valid. Debate is valid. Protest outside is valid. Counter meetings are valid. Diametrically opposed views are valid. And therefore the meeting probably shouldn't be next to a synagogue or a Jewish chaplaincy. Because that's not going to be helpful. Shouldn't be on a Friday evening. How can Jewish students choose to protest if it's a Friday evening? That cuts into religious observance. And that gives a pretty easy guideline for a university. Oh, and by the way, the publicity should not have swastikas on Netanyahu's head advertising it. Because again, that's expressing the IHRA definition. Meeting goes ahead. The meeting organisers have a bit of hassle. Couldn't have the meeting on Friday night when they wanted it. They've had to check out which room it's going to be in. The publicity has to be looked at and agreed. And the student, the Jewish student, the cousin, is not happy because said Palestinian convicted terrorist is speaking and life moves on. That would be good practice, in my view. I've cited that example because it's a real example a lot. Nobody's totally happy, but life isn't about everyone being totally happy. Life's about no negatives for people. And I could cite other examples in the same way.
Yeah.
But
but you're
I'm
very
going to let you question, otherwise I'll talk too long.
Yeah, so you have to be, I know you're a politician, so you're a politician, right? I know lots of, well, anyway, you are a public person, so that's fine. But you did cover three very important issues. You did cover a very easy but very common example, and very easy because, of course, everyone can see it in terms of what is offensive and what's not acceptable, like in Holocaust comparison, very casually, that's one part. Second, also, which you raised, which makes, I'm sure, many people in universities, especially academics and students, concerned would be around and uncomfortable, but that's a journey, again, we all have to take, is around Zionism. So recognizing that Zionism is not something necessary, it's a particular identity, it's a particular politics. Ultimately, and what I take from you is that ultimately it's not what you and I, as non-Jewish people, feel, it's what about Jewish people themselves feel. Whether Zionist or anti-Zionist is their choice. Because one thing which we find in progressive left circles, the progressive circles broadly, is there's always an identification of good Jew versus bad Jews. So good Jews are the anti-Zionist ones. So most of what I find, most of the, let's say, events critical of Israel, even Zionism, they would often be Jewish speakers who are anti-Zionist, and that's fine. But they would often be seen as the example of how to be a good Jew, while majority of Jews are then seen as problematic. And that has to be challenged. I get that. You give very concrete example that, and it's not about anti-Semitism per se, it's about IHR and anti-Semitism, that universities should not be nervous all the time, but they should look at the context. Context matters. It's not about curbing freedom of speech, but of course, making sure mechanism is in place. Something which you didn't say, but I will add to it, which is based on my understanding also of anti-Semitism, is exceptionalizing Israel. So where, and because you did bring in Israel, that where criticizing Israel is fine. Even for me, as an anarchist, you can criticize the existence of all states. You can challenge all states' existence, right? I mean, that's fine because that's what anarchist politics does. However, if we have no problem with, let's say, Pakistan as a Muslim state, or something else as a Christian state, right? And we don't raise that as a problem, and we focus exclusively or obsessively on Israel as a Jewish state and see that as a problem. I think that is anti-Semitism, because what we do, of course, is we exceptionalize Jewish claim for right to self-determination as problematic, while we don't criticize others. And we see Israel as a problem with all human rights abuses, and we don't see similar problems with China, India, whatever, right? And that's how I see it. So for me, it's quite important that we see whatever debate takes place, there's a wider context and understanding.
But the key, for me, is the impact on the individual and on the community. If that was an abstract intellectual debate, it's an abstract intellectual debate away. Academics do sometimes. So, intellectualize away. But when you're dealing with real people and how they see themselves, that's quite different. The people outside the Jewish community and some inside the Jewish community find it really difficult to comprehend the people who came up to me in the Corbyn era and said they were thinking of leaving the country. They couldn't conceive that. Now, in a sense, I can't conceive that. And I'd been the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Antisemitism for 15 years. The concept of leaving the country. But then, my experience is entirely different. How anti-Semitism impacts on me, people jailed for anti-Semitic attacks on me, my family, my staff. So it's impacted. But it doesn't impact on who I am. It impacts on other ways, and it's criminal. So it's serious, very serious. Custodial sentence in one case. But it doesn't impact on who I am. And that's fundamental. Because that is the problem of picking on you or you or you. Because that does impact. And it impacts on people's confidence, it impacts on people's freedoms. It impinges on them. The term I've used a lot is the silence of intimidation, or intimidation of silence even, whereby, people, it's not that people come and start, people don't assault Jewish people in our universities physically. It's virtually never happened, thankfully. That isn't the problem. But that was a starting point for some vice-chancellors. We've had no criminal convictions for anti-Semitism for many years. To which my response is, well, thank God. Now can we deal with the issue of anti-Semitism in universities? Because if that's the... But that was for quite... Not this university, this vice-chancellor, may I say, but that was, and I wouldn't name any of them, that'd be totally... But that wasn't an odd occurrence at the beginning of me speaking to university vice-chancellors. If that's the threshold we're setting, that's not good enough. And that's why... that would go in the same way. And this good Jew, bad Jew, again, I think we could do more work on that because that comes through so much. Let me tell you how the worst I've seen it manifesting, the very worst. I've watched in a meeting of how a self-proclaimed very left-wing Jewish man was cajoled into going further and further and further, in proving his credentials as an anti-racist. Now, I'm guessing this man was heterosexual. That's a guess. I think it's an accurate guess. He was definitely white. He was definitely from an incredibly privileged background. And so he compensated to demonstrate his credentials by being pro-Palestinian. Well, nothing wrong with him being, or anyone else being pro-Palestinian and determining what that means for themselves. So what's wrong with that? But moving then in the meeting to being anti-Israel and then anti-Semitic. Couldn't help himself. And he was being pressured, and you could see it. You could watch it unfolding. To modify who he was, to compensate. I suppose the term, because he threw the term around, was his white privilege. To compensate for that. And he was Jewish. Well, let me show how I can compensate. And that is very, very invidious. And for anybody in any situation. And that's why it's so vital that universities are on top of it. And that big change has come. Now, I'm sure it's not perfect. I'm sure there'll be problems. But that change of attitude is, and understanding is so significant.
In fact, when you said not our, I know it's definitely cannot be our university, because the moment we hear of these things, we take it not as seriously, but we actually have a lot of reflection, engage with people, like the engagement for. So it's not about just signing up, IHR, if we take that definition. We know that many institutions just do it and move on, or try to move on, or try to even not move on, because like UCL, we hear that they might cancel it. ANU in Australia is rejecting it. In our case, these things are secondary. I mean, we do adopt it, but for us, it's more important to bring about, after reflection, culture change within the institution to make substantive change. And ultimate judge is not you, me, or whoever else is there. Ultimate judge would be Jewish students and Jewish colleagues, but let's say focus on Jewish students who are even more disempowered than academics, whether they feel comfortable to express themselves or not. And that has to be the end goal, isn't it?
And that's why having a non-legal definition is so useful. The moment you're in legalities, you're at a high threshold. You're in problems. There's a pre-problem issue. And that's ensuring there isn't a problem where there doesn't need to be one. Take the example of that I gave of the convicted Palestinian terrorist. And I use that term because I can, and anyone else can, therefore, because that was what the courts determined. In that context, that is so powerful, it seems to me. So powerful. And I think universities just working through the simplicity of how they preempt the problem by thinking through impact, thinking through student support, thinking through what freedoms and rights are, even where there is a conflict, a heavy political conflict in this case, of what the politics that are going to be argued are. Don't need to hide away from that. It's actually a case of managing it positively, coherently. Does that mean does that mean I agree with speaker A and not person B? Not necessarily. I might agree with one, I might totally disagree. But that's my right to do so. And again, that's what universities, it's the essence of what universities are about, of exploring ideas, of exchanging ideas. But I would say universities pride themselves on respect rather than merely tolerance. Respect being core to the integral values of a university. And the concept of working definition, therefore, is so useful. There's one on the GRT community it manifests in very different ways, applies in different ways, but it's equally relevant, and I think there could be more. And what I like about this university is it got that at the beginning. Not let us count how many Jewish students. We don't think we've got many Jewish students, was the initial commentary. But that wasn't done as a negative or an excuse. It was, therefore, we'd better find out what we need to do. Because we haven't got a large, active group of Jewish students coming and telling us. And I found that very, very healthy. And it's an example I cited to a number of other universities. So this university should be congratulated, because from the beginning, it was grasping the concept that working definition, having something that's nowhere near the legal threshold, is potentially useful, potentially very useful, and could actually, I'm not an expert in a number of other hatreds and discriminations, but I would modestly suggest the same concept could be used and developed to deal with other problems where there are conflicts and people are feeling uncomfortable and having negatives to who they are. And so what you've done hasn't surprised me, but it has pleased me.
Thank you. In fact, that's true. So when this whole thing came up, I don't think there was ever a discussion of how many. So that was never a concern in terms of how many Jewish students, colleagues, where they count, how to find it. That was never the case. The point is, there's a challenge, what can be done about it? And that was the key part for us. That's there. So thank you for that. On basis of that, maybe, and there's only two questions then, because we'll open up for audience. And if you could be brief us, could you cite some more, and again, you don't need to name universities, some more examples of good practices?
Well, I can give one very good practice that is in the report. If you want to attract, sorry, I should have redone my homework on how many students you've got here. I think 10,000, something like that?
20.
More?
Oh, yeah.
Higher.
Oh, well, much bigger.
20? 25? 25,000.
Yeah.
22.
Okay.
22. Huge university. If you want to attract more Jewish students, there is some good practice in there. Some detailed good practice. I'll cite one, because it is the most obvious. Incredibly, it's the one that universities have done the least on when they could have done. Provide some kosher accommodation. So, now, while I obviously go back quite a few years in terms of my hands-on experience of university life, I have been invited to lots of events that have required me to stay overnight in universities. So I'm reasonably familiar with how university accommodation hasn't changed that much. If you have a block of, say, 8 rooms with a kitchen, and that's the style of accommodation you have widespread in a university, and I'm not saying you necessarily do here, but it's the best illustration. If you designate 1 or 2, or perhaps more, depending on the numbers that you're anticipating, as being kosher kitchens, so Jewish students could live there and cook their own food in a kosher kitchen in ways that are technically acceptable to rabbis or a rabbi. You're going to get more Jewish students applying. B, I think it's reasonable to predict those Jewish students' parents are going to be very happy that their offspring are going to such a university. And C, you will get groupings of Jewish students perhaps trying to get into the same university and the same accommodation. Now, that could apply to other groups of students, but that does seem to me to look at best practice of how you attract in. Two universities have lost a dramatically large number of Jewish students over the years. They need to do something about it. That's one of the things they need to do. I will be letting them know in no uncertain terms. I've let the biggest one with the biggest problem know already. Look, here's something very practical that you need to be doing. If I was you, I'd follow this guidance. But that's a simple example. But the process of thinking that through, even if you can't do it, even if all you have is single room accommodation here, for example. So even if technically you can't do it in the same way, the process of thinking that through is more than cathartic. It's empowering for the Jewish community within the institution. But if you're thinking it through for Jewish students, you're not going to be saying, well, we're only doing and thinking for Jewish students. You're going to be thinking for other groups of students as well. And are we doing everything we should be doing? In other words, everything that I've attempted to do with anti-Semitism in any form, I've always found some of it is transferable to any other identifiable group. Always. Yeah, and sometimes it needs greater brains than me to work out exactly how best that can be done. So I'm not professing to be the expert, but the concept and the attitude is the same. And so that actually is more than anything. Let me repraise this university, because it is the one university that was saying that to me at the very beginning. Very simple terms, very simple, very basic dialogue that we had. Here's what I'm trying to do, well, here's what we're thinking, and here's... But this is usable for other groups as well. And getting that straight away, I mean, that's an example I have cited repeatedly to other universities. The University of Westminster saw it in this way. I'm sure you do as well. And of course, people immediately nod. So it's a soft way of making the point to them. But that's very, very empowering. And if you're part of the staff or students here, may I very boldly suggest you should be rather pleased and proud of that approach in your university. I'm sure there's more you can do and need to do. However, on that key principle, this place is getting that absolutely right.
Thank you. In fact, a comment on that. So we had, remember that hearing on Parliamentary, there was this kind of Parliament, I was part of it, many universities were there. I'll not name two particularly rich universities. When I say rich, very rich, big universities, they were almost competing as who is better. And I remember some of us were uncomfortable, and I was the one who said that it's not about who's better, it's about how we can learn from each other. So, and that's where we agreed and we thought we'd have a discussion. So thank you for that. And of course, through London Higher, I have to remind, and I'll thank London Higher again, because I'm also the chair of London Higher EDI network. And we had that discussion in the past. Last year, we have discussion again. We'll keep having discussion about how to share that good practice. So your report is going to be very helpful for us. One rapid question, that's only 45 seconds for you. What drove you to do this? What's your motivation?
To do what?
This research and the report. Report is secondary, the research. Your passion for challenging anti-Semitism.
I'm only interested in outcomes. Yeah, I have a ridiculous position. I've got a title now. This is all recorded the second biggest non-elected chamber in the world. Only the Communist Party of China has a bigger, slightly more powerful one. So I'm in a total anachronism that when the opportunity comes, I'll be voting to either get rid of or totally transform and change. So I don't need position, because I've got position. I've never been interested in position, but, how could I need any more position now? I'm only interested in actual change, positive change. And I've kind of got a sub-agenda that I haven't hidden. Vice-Chancellors have heard this a little bit already as I've met with them, which is, hang on a minute, we are now a safer place for Jewish students and academics in our universities as anywhere else in the Western world. That is the case. We are significantly better than Canada and the United States. Significantly. We are significantly better than France. Now, it's not a league table, and there isn't a basis of comparing with every country, but we are certainly a safe place for Jewish students and Jewish academics. But there has been a transformation in attitude to secure that. And it is precisely this feeling of discomfort, this feeling of being ignored because of people choosing to be themselves, identifying as they choose, that has been the critical negative. And the more universities stay on board with thinking through how they can address that so that there isn't a negative experience, then we will become the world leaders, our so-called terrible universities. And I go back, and I've already done it fairly brutally with, there may be some here, those in the Jewish community whose experience of being a student was in, say, the 1980s. And we talk about freedom of speech. I was banned from speaking at 3 universities in the 1980s. Me. Banned. Edinburgh University, I had to speak in a pub because I wasn't allowed in the university. My sin was I visited the state of Israel for 4 days. I met Shimon Peres. I met all sorts of people. It was very interesting. I enjoyed it. I learnt a lot. I also spent 4 days sleeping in a tent at Birzeit University with the General Union of Palestinian Students and Fatah, and went to the refugee camps, and went to Hebron and Nablus, and got the PLO at the time, as it was, their perspective, and I spent 4 days. I think that's fairly balanced. But what I learned at the time was some people regarded that as racist, because I'd been to Israel. So that's kind of my motivation in this. And at the same time, people were banning Jewish societies. They banned them at South Bank University, banned them at Sunderland. At the time, it was Sunderland Polytechnic. It was the most infamous case. Tried it at others. Because Zionism is racism. Zionists are racist. Therefore, Jewish societies are racist. We ban racists. Therefore, we're banning. That is at the heart of the argument. Was, is. No. Go criticise the state of Israel as much as you want, in whatever way you're choosing to do so. But don't say that Jewish people who define as Zionists are therefore racist, that you are a racist. You're not entitled to do that. And that is the key learning point. And I don't, and will never be shying away from that. I don't want to talk around the subject, and I'm never going to talk around the subject, because that is the subject that differentiates the universities. Other things as well. But that was the case. And just think of the absurdity. I think of lots of reasons why you might want to ban me from speaking. But the fact that I'd been with the PLO and the Israeli government for 8 days is not one. And that was based on a racist premise. So we're a lot better placed than we are now. And what's happening in the National Youth Students, I should say, as it's on the record, so I've got to say a few things that slip them in. What the National Union of Students has done more than anything else is it's embraced the Union of Jewish Students, and it's said, you are welcome on the inside. That's fundamental. Does that mean there won't be some argument? I'm sure there will be. There might be now. But if the two organisations are well run, there are not going to be many arguments. Because they're going to be predicted in advance and thought through and worked out. Jewish students at the heart of the National Union of Students is very empowering for the Jewish community. It's very empowering for the National Union of Students. It's very empowering for society. Not to the exclusion of anybody else. Quite the opposite. The same concept works for all identifiable groups of students. Absolutely does. Not better access for the Jewish students, but good access. And again, doesn't mean that there won't be fallouts, policy. I had a politician in a political party for nearly 50 years. Yeah, policy. I vote on policy all day, all night, argue all day, all night. I don't really care about policy. I care about actions and the impact on people. And that's what this is about.
Okay, that was more than 45 seconds, but thank you, because you did raise a lot of questions, and I'm sure that answered a lot of questions. So thank you so much. Now, we have around 15 minutes for questions. So if you want to name yourself who you are, that's fine. If you prefer not to, that's also okay. If you could raise your hand, how many of you want to ask questions? We have one. Anyone else? Okay, let's start with it. And if you keep answer brief, then we'll have more questions. First, yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Susan Pascoe from Middlesex University. Thank you for coming here today. We've all really enjoyed hearing from you. I wanted to raise a couple of issues, if that's okay. The first in relation to universities that adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. When problems arise, the immediate reflex action seems to be, well, we adopt IRA, we've got all these policies, look at these wonderful policies we have. And the problem, as we know, is with implementation. So, universities not wanting to alienate their other bodies of students leads me to think that there should possibly be an independent body dealing with complaints against universities of breaches of IRA, like the Office of the Independent Adjudicator. I realise they may not be suitable, but just wanted your view on the need for these issues being dealt with impartially rather than by staff in the university who may have other agendas, including financial impacts by alienating other students. And my second issue is question is whether you met with UCU as part of your research for this report. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to respond?
Yes, I did, and the UCU are mentioned in the report. So yes, and other unions are as well. And the unions are important in this, very important in this, and the staff are very important in this. The question of, I'm more optimistic than your question seemed to indicate you might be in relation to the university's use of IRA. Adoption's an odd word. I don't know why. I'm not sure where the word came from. I might be partly to blame. I don't know, but if so, I apologise. Because what I'm interested in is it's used, that it's publicly used, so it's available, so it's written down, so that a student, actual or future, or a staff member can point to it and say, there's a problem with what's gone on here, or I think there's going to be a problem here, or I'm unhappy about this, and I've got a reference point. It's merely a reference point, but it's incredibly powerful to have a reference point, because if you don't have a reference point, how are you going to make any judgment on it? And I mean, the Office for Students is very cognizant of the IRA definition, but I don't think things are likely to get to their level if universities are properly engaged. And the key conduit, by far, is Union of Jewish Students. Part of my mission, very expressly, including very much so in the Jewish community, is to empower the Union of Jewish Students. For better or for worse, they are the voice of Jewish students. And therefore, any university that isn't consulting with its Jewish society, or if it has such a small number of no organised Jewish society, with the Union of Jewish Students as a national body, then it's got a problem. And the more we can train up and educate universities in that, the better. A lot of work going on doing that. I'm quite bullish about that. Anyone who has influence in the Jewish community, please use that influence to ensure that the Union of Jewish Students is held to account in setting the highest of standards in how it operates, but has the resource to do so. They are a more important organisation than they were a year ago in the world, a lot more. It's very important that they live up to that, and that's at every level. That means good training, clear messaging, that means good resource. The Union of Jewish Students has to be a higher priority for the Jewish community. I think, by the way, for other communities, that same concept and model is one I would recommend strongly.
Thank you. We have a question there.
Okay. Good evening, all. My name is Emmanuel. I must say, first of all, I believe in different colors, one people. And I do know that issue of hatred and discrimination has been a generational thing, between Israel and PLO. And you've been talking about managing it. What about eradicating it? Totally. At least, let this issue of let's manage it this way, because while you were talking about the practices that can be imbibed by the universities, like getting a separate accommodation for them, sincerely what came to my mind was, won't that make them a target? Like we know they are there. I don't know. So I think I believe that the best practice here is my personal opinion, sir, should be integration, because this thing has been on. I don't know how long it's going to last. Even from where I come from, I'm a Nigerian, sir. People fuel insecurity for personal gains, like the Boko Haram now, insurgents in my country. There are some people who are smiling to the banks. People are making billions of naira out of it. So why can't we nip it in the bud from that end? Thank you.
Well, I'm all for eradicating and nipping in the bud, but integration doesn't require equalization. So if someone has a religious belief, if you're a Christian, you have a right to be able to access a church. If you're Muslim, you have a right to access a mosque. You've also a right to access, in some way, halal food. Otherwise, in my view, there's a problem. Why would you go to an institution where you can't get halal food? Same with Jewish students. Some may not want that. Many may not want that. Most will want the ability to have that, from my experience. And most will want the ability to have the basics of religious observance. That's the feedback, that's the research we have. So that's a research finding. So that's not an imposition of here's a good idea from me or from the research team. That's an empirical evidence of barriers. But I don't think that's counter to integration. On managing conflict, I don't want to go into any detail, and you wouldn't allow me to, rightly, and on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. But part of that conflict, you certainly have one group of Israelis, the settlers, who believe that the West Bank belongs to them. You have another group of people, Palestinians, who believe the West Bank belongs to them. Well, that's a conflict situation. That's not going to be resolved simply or straightforwardly. Now, there are many other perspectives and aspirations, but you have certainly two groups who believe this is ours, not theirs. And if that's a political debate or part of a political debate, and it certainly goes right into the heart of political debates, sometimes in an informed basis, sometimes in a very ill-informed basis, then that needs managing. And universities, as a place of debate and learning, need to be good managers of that.
Thank you, Miriam. It is on.
Okay, hi, I'm Miriam Dweck. Great to listen to you. I wondered whether your report is going to consider issues around, for example, how universities might deal with the Apartheid Week and around the sort of campaigns around BDS. Does that actually come into your report, and do you have any suggestions for how to make Jewish students feel safe and staff feel comfortable and safe in those instances? Perhaps?
Yes, so the report is a report, and then it is an index of good practice. Obviously subjectively determined good practice, but lots of it and detailed good practice. That is addressed directly. It's addressed very directly. And some of the good practice could be emulated elsewhere. So there are ways in which people have found, some I think obvious, some very inventive and creative, of how those issues are dealt with. And again, the working definition, the IRA definition helps. I'll give one example. Does the IRA definition say you can't have an apartheid week? It doesn't say anything about language like that. So you can't, some people may want to do this, but you can't use the IRA definition of anti-Semitism to say having an apartheid week in a university is anti-Semitic. You can state that, but you can't reference the IRA definition in stating that, so it doesn't say that. I can think of an example from a university, it's University of Exeter, I'll name it, because it's a positive example, where the Apartheid Week a couple of years ago had what was described as street theatre, an Israeli checkpoint. And the students had to pass through the Israeli checkpoint, including the Jewish students. Now, that was removed for health and safety grounds, but referencing the IRA definition would have shifted that. We want to have, in my view, the use of the word apartheid isn't helpful. I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's a distraction to the issues of Palestinians and Israel. But some people are using it. Well, if you're going to have your apartheid week, have your apartheid week. If you're going to have street theatre, have your street theatre. But what's not acceptable is to disadvantage Jewish students going about their normal university life. So have it over there, don't have it here where everyone has to walk. Pretty simple. That would be, in my view, good use of the IRA definition. Doesn't stop freedom of speech, but there are ways in which its application can be used. So a Jewish student might feel unhappy that there's an apartheid week and there's a etc., etc. Entitled to feel unhappy. But that's democracy. But if they're blocked going to their lecture by it, that is something entirely different. And I don't think the dividing line on what's acceptable and what isn't is complex. I think it's obvious in most instances. And that example is obvious of what the difference is.
What about BDS?
So BDS, I mean, we do have a very specific example. I think we have a couple of examples, but one in particular on BDS. So what does BDS mean? No, what does it mean? Is it an educational tool? Is it a political campaign? So if a BDS campaign attempts to stop Jewish students accessing kosher food, that is a problem, not acceptable. And some kosher food will be Israeli products. Some is, in this country. Some kosher options, particularly ones with sugar in, so long-lasting ones, as opposed to not long-lasting. If you're in a university that's well away from a Jewish community, that might be the only kosher food or style of kosher food available. Should a Jewish student be restricted from having that? Doesn't mean that someone shouldn't say, well, we have a BDS policy. That's contentious, it's going to be argued. But again, the IRA definition does not say you cannot have a BDS policy. If you interpret IRA accurately, is a BDS campaign anti-Semitic? Not necessarily. Could it be? Yes, it could be.
I think, well, maybe not IHR, but it is, I mean, that's my view. It is because it does, again, exceptionalize Israel as an evil state compared to any other state. But that's not IHR, but I'm saying that is problematic. In fact, just as an example, in my experience, like, I have become chair of a particular LGBTQ organization internationally. The first thing that came up was adoption to support BDS. We had a vote of around 30 people. One voted against, that was myself, as a chair, by the way. One abstained and 28 voted in favor. Except out of 28, 7 or 8 came to me later so that they agreed with my concerns. But I felt, then why did you not say it there? And that tells you a lot about group thinking in academic context, where whether people like it or not, they think, and that's the thing, they think in this case, it's better to support BDS, etc., be anti-Israel, than challenge these kind of anti-Semitism. But that's my question. One final question from here, and then we'll conclude, because we have a few concluding remarks. Yes.
Hello, my name is Joachim Silva. I work for Petit Patel, and I'm intending to become a master's degree student at this university next year. I believe in defending human rights full stop, but if I defend the human rights of both Palestinians and Israelis, how do I do this without alienating people? And as a student, how can I make both parties find common ground and support them with their education, that we are ultimately human and all worthy of respect?
Oh, the answer to that is by articulating the way you just articulated. That's an example of exactly what you need to continue doing. You know, when one's dealing with a conflict situation, any conflict situation, it's often not straightforward. You know, the classic, when I was a member of Parliament, which I was to recently elected, representing people, a neighbour dispute. Who's right in a neighbour dispute? Normally, if a dispute comes from a member of Parliament, neither side is entirely right. There hasn't been compromise, there hasn't been understanding, there hasn't been coming together. There's been a clash that's got out of control. Sometimes it has racism in it. And it gets particularly nasty. But in dealing with that, if you're not trying to mediate and listen and respect the points of view and perspectives, even where you disagree, then there's going to be a problem. So the key is respect, in my view. That doesn't mean there's always a coming together of views and perspectives. And so there's absolutely no rational reason why one cannot, and you cannot, be advocating human rights in a way that is even-handed. Indeed, if you're able to do that and do so effectively, you become all the more powerful and influential. So more power to your elbow in trying to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. I missed out the last question. Sorry, I missed out. So please.
Thank you. Natasha Kaul, I'm an academic at this university. So I'm sorry I had a meeting and came in late, but this was a very valuable conversation, and just a very quick comment. I think that one of the struggles that one has with, conflict is inevitable, as you just said, but getting the narratives that will help us to move towards reconciliations, partial even, is always harder, but really important. And I think those narratives are really important to actually foster. And I was struck by the thing that you said about the transferability of some of these insights, right? It doesn't just work for this group. This reflection will work for other groups as well. So it kind of sets in motion that process. And the very last point, counterfactual thinking. I think a lot of this and getting people to understand what this is about is really counterfactual thinking, getting them to think that it isn't okay to stereotype, it isn't okay to generalize, human rights are important, states aren't equal to individual people, etc. And that counterfactual thinking, I think, may help us in, creating some of these narratives between, say, the Union of Jewish Students and, the other students who may not always be acting out of malice, but sometimes simply out of an ignorance or a lack of enough reflection on the transferability and also the counterfactual aspect of it.
Absolutely. And it's usually, from my experience, not malice, but if there aren't systems in place for creating good dialogue, views become entrenched, and then there becomes an ignorance of the other on all sides because views become entrenched. And in this report, the critical thing in this report, there are two critical things, if I could end on this. Number one, the working definition of anti-Semitism. We've asked every university. There are no examples, zero, that any university has been able to give where it has stopped free speech or where there's an allegation that it's chilled free speech or research of any kind. It hasn't happened. And it shouldn't have happened. And it could only happen if people are misunderstanding what a working definition is and what that definition says. That hasn't happened, which to me shows its strength. Secondly, we're publishing a significant amount of good practice. There are, I couldn't even try and list how many examples that would directly assist in your point. And they're not ones where I am saying, this might be a good idea for someone to try. These are ones that are being used with success at the moment. Some fascinating ones. And the most important thing for practitioners that I would plea is go through those good practices and see which ones you could use and apply in your universities. And the contacts are there to be able to speak to the people because there are some fascinating, some brilliant practices. What's interesting is how shy people have been to tell others about them. Well, we're simply publishing, and I'm not going to reveal, but University of Westminster does get a best practice within it, one amongst a good number of universities. And what we've attempted to do is not repeat, here's 10 good ways of having Holocaust memorial. We haven't done that. It's not repetitive. We've picked what we think are particularly interesting practices from around the country. And there's a number that are absolutely brilliant that most universities could learn from, exactly in this kind of, how do you foster respect? What are the structures? What are the mechanisms? And I would strongly recommend all of them to read, and there will be some, there may just be one that you could apply here that could make a big difference. And if it's just one, then I'd be very relaxed that we've done a good job.
Thank you. May I invite, we'll have time for clap, don't worry, Mark Corbett from London Higher.
On the stage. Hi, I'm Mark. I'm Head of Policy at London Higher. We're a membership body for universities across London. We've got a diverse group of universities, the post-92s research, and obviously University of Westminster is one of our treasured members as well. We recently published a report on the student experience, looking at the HEPI data, showing what the London experience was like, and it was really good. It was good news. It was actually better than the UK average. But if there's a section of our students where there is no parity of experience due to university not recognising or not acting or not knowing how to act on anti-Semitism, then that should really change. And we're very grateful for Lord Mann, John Mann, for his report. I'm looking forward to the recommendations and to make sure that universities are equipped with the knowledge and the research and his experience to make those changes at the universities. I'd like to also thank Dibyesh, the chair of our Quality, Diversity and Inclusion Group. Looking forward to working with him in the future as newly appointed chair, and we're very grateful for the University of Westminster for inviting us here today. And thank you, Lord Mann, for a very, very interesting conversation.
Good clap, yeah. Sorry. And let me invite Professor Alex Hughes, Deputy Vice Chancellor of our university.
Thank you. Some words of very heartfelt thanks from me to Lord Mann, to Dibyesh, to the colleagues from London Higher who were also involved in organising this evening. It's been an absolute privilege to host this debate, this discussion this evening. It's been a privilege to hear what's been a very rich discussion and to learn from it, actually, because we are in the business of learning, all of us in universities, and I think there are a number of very key things that we've learnt this evening, or been reminded of. The first is that anti-Semitism is a practice of racism. It has its own flavour, it's an age-old flavour, it's something which is often elided or dismissed because it is not seen to be mainstream racism. It is mainstream racism, and we forget that at our peril, we forget it as human beings, and we forget it in universities. So I think the opportunity to reflect on that this evening has been incredibly important. You also reminded us of the centrality of the IHRA definition and how to engage with that definition. It's been a contested thing. It's a useful guide. We need to work with it. We need to think about it in the ways that John Mann suggested. We need to use it to create positive change. This is not difficult, and again, it's incumbent upon us to do that properly. And I think finally you reminded us of some of the really practical things we can do. We don't want any of our student groups, any of our student communities to feel isolated, disenfranchised, separate. And there are lots of really concrete things we can do. Some of them will be captured, or lots of them will be captured in the report, and I'm sure that universities, and including this university, will want to engage with those. You said some very nice things about the University of Westminster. Thank you so much. We know that in order to address the kind of things we've been talking about this evening, we need to work with our Jewish colleagues, we need to work with our Jewish students. That work has begun. It will continue, it will involve dialogue, it will involve listening, and it will involve those concrete actions that you talked about, because we're all in the business of concrete action, not abstract theorisation. So thank you also to the audience for coming. I'm sure that we've all had a very, very thought-provoking evening. We will go away and think further about that. But in the meantime, there's opportunity to have further discussion for the rest of the session. So I'm going to hand back to Dibyesh and just say a very big thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Alex. And finally, Dr. Peter Bonfield, our Vice Chancellor and President.
Thanks, Dibyesh. So, great to see you all here. Colleagues at Westminster, students at Westminster, it's great to see you here and be together. Guests, friends from wherever you come from, please feel a hearty welcome at our hall here in Westminster. So I'm Vice Chancellor and President here. I spoke with some other Vice Chancellors earlier today. They know you're here. I said I'd report back on some of the practice. We're looking forward to your report, which is going to help us all do better. And just my own story and connection here. I started here 5 years ago. We're an amazing, diverse and complex university. It's enriched by the different lived experiences, the different ways we see the world. It helps us all understand things better and become better citizens. I met some colleagues and students here who were Jewish early in my time here who felt very uncomfortable and unsafe in our community. We needed to do something about that. Trying to find out what to do and how to do it in the right way was very challenging. I've phoned you up or found a way of meeting you. We had a very, I'm trying to think of a way of saying rough tough without saying rough tough. Anyway, it was a no messing conversation about things, and that started. And then we learnt, we listened, we've applied things in our own community, very keen that our Jewish colleagues and students feel safe, feel they belong. We want no trace of anti-Semitism or any other racism. We also fiercely protect academic freedom and freedom of speech, so finding a way of working together, using the definition actually to support and protect against anti-Semitism and improve safety. And feeling of safety and belonging for our Jewish colleagues and students is really imperative, whilst also understanding how it protected people to speak up against things they want to speak up against in a way that isn't anti-Semitic was really important. We've got our Freedom of Expression Working Group, which is there to see if there are any feelings of chilling or practice that restricts that. So far we haven't had anything. And then we've continued our occasional dialogue. We've worked with, I'm Deputy Chair of London Higher, so it's been really good with London Higher. Also, we had our session recently at Middlesex University to learn more. You were there too, thank you very much for that, as were the Union of Jewish Students and others. So, great to have you here. Thank you very much for coming. As ever, your information has been thought-provoking, practical and informative, and we need to keep working together to find our way of moving forward in a way that allows everybody to feel safe, to feel they belong, for their lived experience to be understood, and we work as a community together to further that. So, but we now have drinks and food outside in reception. We can enjoy each other's company, provoked by and stimulated by the discussion, and see what comes future. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Dibyesh, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here tonight.
Now, before drinks and food, by the way, you'll see well, I haven't seen it, but it should be a wide range of food of all kinds. But I would like to thank Zara there. Zara and Victoria, they have helped me organize it. Just Theo and Leon here, who always help us with the recording, and this is what will be there in posterity. Thank you again. Okay. And before that, we'll have reception. But Guy, do you want to stand up? Everyone kept talking Union of Jewish Students. At least I know one person from there, so I'm meeting him tomorrow, by the way. So you can say hello to him later. And Joshua here, he's active in Jewish Society, and my assumption he's the designated president of Jewish Society very soon. So that's Joshua. You can say hello. And I did want to thank someone, but John wants to thank them, so let me pass it on to him.
So, as ever, the politician tries to take the credit for all the work. It's a bad habit of all politicians, some worse than me on that. The others who should be thanked, we have 3 people who've worked on the report. We have Amy and Nina who've helped to write the report, and we have Amanda who's done 29 university visits, was the researcher throughout the report, and has been the key element in pulling this together. So I'll take responsibility for any errors, but they can take the credit for the outcome, and that's very, very deserved for them.
And no more thanks. Well, I can thank him, of course, John, but please join us for reception, and thank you, John, again. So thank you.